Hey, what's up folks, Jambook Reviews here, and today I'll be doing an author spotlight on Margaret Cecilia Thompson. Margaret Cecilia Thompson was born and raised in Jamaica where she attended the St. Andrew High School for Girls. At age 19, she left for the United States to study at Barnard College and later went on to earn a PhD in English from the City University of New York. She currently teaches literature and creative writing at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. As a writer, she has 2 published novels, several short stories, and a screenplay. Her first novel, The True History of Paradise, was shortlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award in the year 2000. Her second novel, The Pirate's Daughter, won the Essence Literary Award for Fiction in 2008. So, now that the bio is out of the way, I'll be reviewing both of her novels. The True History of Paradise is the author's first novel and was published in 1999. The story is set in 1970s Jamaica when the country was at the height of political turmoil and under a state of emergency. It follows the character Jean Landing, who is secretly on her way to the airport after her sister's funeral, but she is unsure whether or not she should leave Jamaica. She is accompanied by her lifelong friend Paul, who may know what happened to her sister. As they travel across the country, Jean reflects on her life with her sister Lena, her mother Monica, and her father Roy, how their relationship changed over time, and Jamaica along with it. So as you could probably tell, a lot of the story is told through flashbacks, and we learn a lot about Jean's family and Jamaica's history. Because of her experiences in her youth, Monica is a very strict parent with her daughters. Lena is the rebellious older sister who constantly gets into a lot of trouble, which leads to a rocky relationship with Monica. Jean is the youngest and somewhat indecisive one caught between them. She wants to be adventurous and outgoing, but she also wants to make the right life choices, and Roy tries his best to keep the peace in the household. The family has a lot of ups and downs, and what's cool is that when anything happens, the wider family, aunts, grandmothers, etc., come together to help them to figure out the best way forward. The story also has an element of magical realism to it, in that Jean's ancestors communicate with her, and this is the way the author explores the history of Paradise, through the many different peoples who came to Jamaica from around the world, and through their stories we learn that Jamaica has never been a bed of roses. There are many topics the story explores, including motherhood, sisterhood, mental health, racism and colorism, particularly the complexities they cause for interracial families, and it also overtly explores the conflicting political ideologies in the country and the resulting violence. The overarching theme of the story is taking control of one's life, but I think the major underlying theme is the erosion of safety. As the story progressed, the country went from somewhat idyllic to increasingly chaotic and violent. This is symbolized by the gradual appearance of grill work and burglar bars on houses. Jean's mother, who represents the conservative view, refuses, saying she's not turning her home into a prison, while her neighbors are getting them. Jean, on the other hand, realizes that she gets very afraid when she's anywhere that is unprotected. So there is always an element of potential danger in the background of the story. Now I'll talk about the writing style. It's very descriptive, as for much of the story the characters are on a road trip. The author was able to convey the beauty of the landscape and contrast the lifestyles of urban and rural Jamaica. There is an omniscient narrator for the most part, but the chapters with the ancestors are narrated in first person, as if they were talking directly to Jean. The general dialogue mixes both Jamaican and English, so it shouldn't be too hard to understand. There are explicit scenes in the novel, so it is for a mature audience. All in all, this was a good read. I think the author was able to capture the spirit of the time while telling a compelling story. Now I'll review her second novel, The Pirate's Daughter. This story is set in Port Antonio, Jamaica from roughly the 1940s to the 1970s. It is based around the Hollywood actor Errol Flynn and the time he lived in Jamaica and bought an islet off its coast called Navy Island. The story is narrated by his fictional Jamaican daughter May, who is writing a story about how her parents met and her own life. Her mother Ida met Flynn as a teenager and falls for him in the early part of the story, so content warning for that. Flynn in real life was said to have been involved with some teenage girls, so the author used that as a jumping off point. It is told from Ida's perspective, and we see the repercussions of the events on her life, with her trying to get things back on track. And when May comes into the picture, she has to deal with growing up as an illegitimate child, neglected by her parents, and Flynn goes from the Hollywood image to the reality. The premise of the novel wasn't very appealing, but as I read it, the historical world building kept my attention, getting to see what life was like for the mainly upper-class locals and also foreigners who settled in Jamaica prior to independence. Another thing I liked was how realistic the characters were, particularly the side characters felt like they had lives going on outside of their interactions with Ida and May. Ida in her youth was somewhat spoiled and naive. Bad things happened to her over the years, but she doesn't let that stop her from living her life. At the same time, her self-centeredness affects how she raises May. The disconnect from her parents influences May's development, and we get to see the contrast between a mother and daughter growing up in different generations. Their mixed heritage caused them both to have to deal with racism and colorism, but also allowed the story to explore different parts of Jamaican society, like the story of Ida's father, who is the black sheep of a wealthy Lebanese family, or her grandmother Oni, who is a maroon living isolated in the Blue Mountains. Flynn drifted in and out of the story, but two of his friends became very prominent in it. Carl, the antique dealer, is part of a mystery subplot that I ignored for most of the story. And then there's Nigel, the writer, who I could tell was based on Ian Fleming. Both of them became very close to the main characters, so there are many interesting family members and friends in this one. Now I'll talk about the writing. The book is written mostly in third person with some odd chapters that are epistolary. As I mentioned before, it is structured as if May is writing it. It's really an embedded narrative in the form of a pirate tale, and quotes from it bookend the chapters. It's a Jamaican novel, so there is some use of the language, but I do feel that the story was written with an international audience in mind, because there is quite a bit of explaining of local knowledge in the text. Now I'll talk about the central pirate motif. It's obvious from the title to the framing of the story to Errol Flynn, who was famous for starring in Swashbucklers, but I think it's most prominent in the character of May. In her youth, she is unruly and tomboyish, obsessed with pirate stories and swimming and the mysterious island where her rumored father lives. She is strong-willed like her mother and adventurous like her father, but more likable than them because she actually learns from her mistakes. I think the story is ultimately about her charting her own course in life. So as you could probably tell, there is a lot happening in this novel, which I think is what weakened it for me. The plot meandered a bit, so when the big reveals happened in the end, it didn't wow me as it should have. So great world building, interesting characters, so-so plot. So now I'll talk about the novels together. The first notable thing is the timeline. The Pirate's Daughter runs from the 1940s to the 1970s, while Paradise is set mostly in the 1970s, so they overlap at the state of emergency period. The author would have been living in Jamaica at that time, and it's evident that that era left quite an impression on her. The 70s was a very critical decade in Jamaican history, and the theme of change stood out in both novels. They capture when Jamaica became self-aware, an awareness that manifested itself in the form of violence, seen from the perspective of those who had the most to lose from that happening, the upper class. Both sets of main characters are from well-to-do families. Monica owned one of the largest bakeries in the island, and Ida's father was a businessman from a wealthy family. Jamaican novels often give the perspective of the working class, so it was interesting to see a different point of view in that regard. The next thing that stood out was the portrayal of the mother-daughter relationships, as they followed a very noticeable pattern. In both novels, the mothers made mistakes when they were young, and as their daughters got closer to that age and seemed to be following a similar path, the mothers became overprotective with a kind of tough love that did more to alienate their children than help them. Even though the two mothers, Monica and Ida, are two different characters in two different stories, to me they had the same, I would say, voice, if that makes sense. The gender dynamic was also quite interesting. As you could probably tell from the reviews, the novels very much centered the female perspective, but not at the expense of making the male characters one-dimensional. The relationships between the mothers and fathers were very strained or volatile for the most part, but the father-daughter relationships were more neutral if not positive. Also, in the coming-of-age parts of the novels, the girls always had a male companion who supported them. Many of the antagonists were men, but there was definitely diversity in characterization. Love is another thing both novels examined, whether it be familial, platonic, or romantic. We see how love, or the lack of it, influences the decisions of the characters. But reading The Pirate's Daughter in 2021 and knowing the things that have come to light about, Hollywood with Weinstein and others, the Flynn-Ida relationship looks a lot worse. It makes me wonder how common that type of relationship would have been in 1940s Jamaica. Another thing that looked strange this year was how unusual the state of emergency and burglar bars seemed to the characters in Paradise. In modern Jamaica, a house without grillwork or some form of security looks out of place, and state of emergencies happen every few months. I guess that's a sad commentary on the times we live in. But yeah, very interesting novels. Get them if you want a trip to the old Jamaica. Thanks for listening.